I want to first of all thank Bishop Mack for extending this opportunity to me again to preach this sermon that I've been kind of sitting on for a little while, and I'm grateful for this opportunity. I want to call your attention to the book of Exodus, chapter 2, verse 11. One day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and saw their forced labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinfolk. I want to talk about for a few minutes, I can't breathe. I find it interesting that when we first meet Moses as an adult, we find him hanging out at what the Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann refers to as the brickyard. The brickyard is made up of Pharaoh's slaves, and the only thing that matters in the brickyard is making bricks. The brickyard is an oppressive, exploiting, dehumanizing, non-affirming, and unresponsive but demanding place. The brickyard has no soul. It is a place of existential death. The traumatic stresses of the brickyard make it hard to breathe. The brickyard takes away one's right to breathe freely. The brickyard is comparable to somebody having a chokehold of oppression on you, or having a knee of domination on your neck, denying you the freedom to breathe. According to the record, on the eve of creation, God created all humans in God's divine image. God blew the breath of life into our humanity, affirming each person as a free, valued, creative, purposeful, self-determining, and dignified human being, stamped with the divine seal of the Creator. Every human being is born to breathe God's fresh air of freedom that enables everybody to fulfill her or his dream and potential. We are beings of God's being, spirits of God's spirit, souls of God's soul, freedom of God's freedom, and breath of God's breath. Nobody has the authority or the right to take away your breath. We were born to breathe. We got a right to breathe. To breathe is to live, and to live is to breathe. The brickyard was the last place you would expect to find an Egyptian prince hanging out. Moses was rather an adopted Hebrew by Pharaoh's daughter, but raised as an Egyptian aristocrat. He was Pharaoh's royal grandson. He possessed royal status. He was a prince with many privileges. Moses had nothing socially, economically, or politically in common with the Hebrew slaves. Yet, in spite of Moses' royal status, he is seen hanging out in the brickyard with slaves. He identified with the slaves. He connected with the rejected in the brickyard. Then one day, while Moses was hanging around the brickyard, he observed how cheap a slave's life was valued. He saw an Egyptian soldier beat the holy breath out of a slave. The Hebrew word nakah is the verb that is used to describe the violent force of a final blow. Outraged after seeing the final blow exerted by an Egyptian soldier against a Hebrew slave, Moses' first response was one of violent retaliation by killing the Egyptian soldier, burying him in the sand, and running away from Egypt into exile in order to save his life. The violence of the brickyard disabled Moses' ability to help the suffering slaves. Now, my brothers and my sisters, the brickyard is analogous to the inner city ghetto or hood or reservations where African Americans, Native Americans, people of color, and the poor live. The late African American psychologist Kenneth Clark, in his now classic book, Dark Ghetto, defined the ghetto, which can also be applied to Native American reservations, as a social, political, educational, and above all, economic colony. He goes on to say that the inhabitants of the colony are subject peoples, victims of greed, cruelty, and sensitivity, shame, guilt, and fear. The ghetto consists of overcrowded streets, deteriorating housing, infant mortality, high crime, drugs, gangbanging, high unemployment, underemployment, various diseases, traumatized residents, and existential death. Not only is the colony socially, politically, and economically colonized, but psychologically colonized. Psychological oppression turns you against yourself, your community, and makes you participate in your own oppression. Many of the inhabitants of the hood are emotionally broken. They are oppressed and depressed, despaired and desperate, angry and anxious, hostile and hopeless, resentful and rejected, and alienated and apathetic. But also, as ironic as it may seem, many of the inhabitants exemplify grandiose behavior. It is hard to breathe when your body, soul, and mind are colonized by outside foreign forces that aid and encourage self-destruction. Life is devalued and disrespected in America's brickyards. The late professor of the sociology of religion at Duke Divinity School and a professor of our own Bishop Mack, Dr. C. Eric Lincoln, once noted that life is cheap, but black life is the cheapest of all. In the colonized brickyards, the sacred breath of the oppressed and people of color is devalued by racist Euro-American law enforcement, judicial system, educational system, corporate systems, and by racist vigilantes all over the nation. The cry, "I can't breathe," is a lament that's indicative that black lives and people of color lives do not matter. For 400 years of existential trauma, the cry, "I can't breathe," has fallen on deaf ears. It is difficult to heal when you continue to experience one trauma after another trauma. Many Euro-Americans see the heartbreaking futility of the brickyard every day. They even feel the national shame associated with traumatic black suffering, yet they cannot bring themselves to feel any guilt. I am constantly told, "That was a long time ago. Get over it, let it go, and move on." I'm reminded of a story that the African-American mystic and religious leader Howard Thurman tells of an incident that happened to him while he was working for a white family, particularly as a young man, doing odd jobs around the house. One day while working in the garden, one of the children, a daughter, started sticking him with a sharp object. He reacted by saying, "Stop it, that hurts." She looked at him and smiled, and then said, "You can't hurt." To ask black people or native people or people of color to get over it and move on is to assume they cannot hurt. Help me, Holy Ghost. We are not human enough to feel. How insensitive can anybody be? Oppressed people relive their trauma every day. Do I have a witness? To paraphrase the psychoanalyst Robert Stollerow, who noted that continuous trauma awakens the original trauma, which makes it impossible to heal and breathe freely. Let me make it live. The events of the last few months are living examples that black life really do not matter. One traumatic event followed another traumatic event. It was reported that after 2 months that Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia was killed while jogging black by 2 white vigilantes. Shortly after that, an African-American woman, Breonna Taylor, EMT first responder to the coronavirus, was shot and killed in her Louisville, Kentucky apartment by police who botched a bogus search warrant. Then a few weeks ago, the world witnessed the public execution of George Floyd, a black man, by 4 police officers. George was tortured and executed when one officer ruthlessly put his knee on George's neck for 8 minutes as he laid on the ground, handcuffed and defenseless. He kept saying, "I can't breathe." Then in Atlanta, Brooks was shot in the back 2 times by the police for sleeping while black and drunk. 1 year ago, Elijah McClain, a young black man, 23 years old, had a romance going on with his violin, died in police custody after going to the store to get some iced tea. Trapped in a police chokehold, he cried out, "I can't breathe." shall I also summon Trayvon Martin, 12-year-old Tamir Rice, killed while playing with a toy gun, while white children play with toy guns all the time. But also remember Michael Brown, Lamont McDonald, Walter Scott, Freddie Gray, Sandra Bland, and Philando Castile, who was killed in front of his children in his car by the police. Fathers and mothers often tell their children, especially their sons, when they are detained by the police, to comply and cooperate. Well, even when you comply, you're still killed because black life is devalued and cheap. Acts of terror are motivated by a racist ideology that is both insane and sadist. It assumes people of color are not human and cannot hurt or feel pain. George Floyd's death touched the world. The world had finally seen enough. People protested the world over. In spite of 46 minus one's old Nixon 60s rhetoric of law and order, nobody wants to really hear it. Help me, Holy Ghost. The cry, I can't breathe, is not about law and order. It is about justice for the victims of violence and injustice. Even Pope Francis spoke out and said, we cannot tolerate or turn a blind eye to racism and exclusion in any form, and yet claim, help me, Holy Ghost, to defend the sacredness of every human life. The protests in America's streets are about affirming the humanity and sacredness of life and the sacredness of land. All of our institutions, especially law enforcement and corporate America, must change to affirm the sacredness of life, especially black life and people of color. Somebody has to tell 46 minus 1 that the Civil War is over. And the Confederates did not only lose the war, but the Confederacy no longer exists. And he is not the president of the Confederacy. Do I have a witness? The struggle for equality is continuous. America has to face the truth of its own tragic history and change. My Apache brother, Winslow Nosey, put it in perspective when he said, we must all decolonize from the intent of how America was founded to enable us to call America home. Every American myth and every lie must be challenged, decolonized, and changed if equality is going to be realized. And I really appreciate the struggles that our young people have engaged themselves in to change this nation. That's why Confederate statutes must come down. Well, as I close, the African-American poet Langston Hughes said it best. Oh yes, I say it plain. America was never America to me. And yet I swear this oath, America will be. The national protest across America is to make the American creed and deed connect. And I encourage our young people to keep the struggle going for justice alive and see it all the way through. Well, as I close, Moses' first response to bring justice to the brickyard for a murdered slave by an Egyptian soldier failed. Full of rage, Moses used violence to change the brickyard. Moses, however, was not successful. He failed, and he had to flee into exile. He did not realize that the struggle was not individual, but in fact institutional. But I'm so glad, oh yes I am, that when Moses returned a second time to Egypt, he did not come to defend individual slaves, but rather Moses returned to dismantle the entire institution of slavery so that every slave could breathe freely without chains. He did not return under Pharaoh's favoritism or authority. Moses came back with the moral authority of Yahweh, the God of liberation. To paraphrase Martin Luther King, that pharaohs never surrender power voluntarily. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Armed with moral authority, trust in God, and dependent on the power of nonviolence through plagues, he dismantled the oppressive brickyard and freed the slaves. Egypt was paralyzed until every slave was free to breathe and to leave Egypt. My brothers and sisters, the collective protests around the country and world are lifting oppressive knees off vulnerable necks so that people of color and the poor can breathe freely. You got the moral and spiritual power to make change happen, to turn protests into liberating policies, to set others free. God gave you breath to help others to breathe. Make your breath matter. Breathe until justice runs down as waters and righteousness as a mighty stream. Breathe until truth crushed to earth will rise again. Breathe until every valley of injustice is made low. The crooked places of oppression are made straight. The rough places of suffering are made smooth. And the glory of the Lord is revealed. And all of God's people will be able to breathe the air of freedom together. The songwriter penned these words: "Let it breathe on me. Let it breathe on me. Let the breath of God's freedom, God's dignity, and God's love breathe on us."
Hello. First of all, we want to thank you so much for your generous support so that we can continue to operate in excellence. The following are ways to give tithes and offerings using technology. Use the Push Pay app or go to Giving page on the Union Baptist website. Use the Cash app, which is $UBC Trade 1200. Use the Givelify app, Union Baptist Church, Winston-Salem. For Rise Up giving, please use the designated Cash app, $Union Baptist Rise Up. If you don't use technology for giving, You may bring your tithes, offering, and Rise Up campaign payments on Sundays from 10 a.m. till noon. Envelopes will be available. Or you can mail checks only. No cash, only checks to 1200 North Trade Street, Winston-Salem, North Carolina, 27101. Now, please make a note of the following announcements. Thursdays at 6:30 p.m., it's Breaking Bread with Bishop. Get the family together and have family dinner while watching Bible study. If this is not a convenient time, you can view the video 24 hours a day on our Facebook page, website, or YouTube. Saturday morning worship schedule. 9 a.m. phone line worship. 10 a.m. C2C remix phone line worship. 11 a.m. Saturday Connect worship by Zoom. On Saturday evening, we will have our phone line church conference call at 7 p.m. Our Sunday morning worship schedule, 8:30 a.m. phone line worship, 9 a.m. Sunday school, 10 a.m. virtual worship. Go to the Union Baptist website, YouTube, or Facebook. 12 p.m. service will be broadcast on the Truth radio station, 1340 a.m. Please note the new number for our phone line. Dial 774-258-4711. No code needed. Dial straight in. Please continue to visit the Union Baptist website updates page. Click on the members button. And remember, wash your hands frequently. Avoid large crowds over the size of 10. Cover coughs and sneezes. Stay at home when you're sick. Don't hoard food. The supply chain is fine right now. Have a blessed week.